Hello and welcome to the video on anatomical positions and sections. The first thing to discuss in this video is that anatomical position always assumes that the body is in the same position. So the body position would be with the hands at the sides and palms facing upwards. Another critical part that does take a little bit of thinking at first is that any reference to the body assumes that the body's in that position and you're assuming the perspective of the person that you're discussing, or I shouldn't even say person, because like in the video here, all of the pictures will be of people, but you're assuming the perspective of the specimen. So for example, if you were to talk about right and left side, it is actually the right and left side of the specimen or of the individual, not of the person's perspective, because right and left is subjective depending on which way you're looking at something. Whereas if you talk about the right and left side of the organism that you're looking at, that is something that is helpful. So you'll see that more when we get to the larger picture coming up in a moment. The two other terms to talk about here on the first page is supine. So this way we're saying the person's laying down with their face up if they're in the supine position. If they're in the prone position, the person is lying with their face down, face facing downward. So I think the thing that's helpful is to go through and talk a little bit about this diagram. This shows all of the major terms that we'll be discussing. So the first one to look at is the right and the left term. So you can see these are assuming the perspective of the individual specimen. So if you're looking at this, this is the right-hand side from your perspective. This is the left-hand side. But we're taking this from the perspective of the organism or the specimen. So that's something to keep in mind for starters. Another thing to consider with all of these positions is they're always going to be relative to something else. So for example, we have superior and inferior. That's shown on the right-hand side here. So if we're talking about superior, we're talking about the body's vertical axis. So if something is higher than another part, it's said to be superior to it. So if something is inferior, then it is below the other part. So the thing to consider with this is these terms all require you to be comparative. They require you to talk about two things. So the way to think about this is the head is superior to the neck, right? The head is above the neck, so the neck is inferior. But in another example, you could say the neck is superior to the torso because the neck is above the torso. So just because something is either superior or inferior in one example doesn't mean that it's always going to be that way since it's comparative. So, the head is superior to the neck, whereas the neck is superior to the torso. So it depends on what you're comparing. So it's the same thing when it comes to this idea of distal and proximal. The main difference with these two is that proximal refers to something that's closer to the torso, whereas distal refers to something that's further away from the torso. So I think the easiest way to consider these is to go with an example. So a finger is then distal to the wrist because a finger is further away from the torso than the wrist, whereas you would say the wrist is distal to the elbow. And then you could say that the shoulder is proximal to the elbow. So proximal meaning closer to the torso. The midline is also shown on this individual. So medial is closer to the middle, whereas lateral is further from the middle. So your navel, for example, would be part of your medial line, right? Your belly button, whereas moving further away from that, you are moving laterally in the other direction. Distal and proximal is shown down here just with the lower body limbs. So same idea with that though, where proximal is something that is closer to the torso, distal is something that's further away. So we would say that like the foot is distal to the knee, it's further away, whereas the hip, is proximal to the knee. If we look at the example on the right then, some anatomical positions in humans use the same terms. So for example, anterior and ventral refer to the same side for us. So like the anterior side is the front side, same thing with the ventral side, whereas the posterior side is the dorsal side. If you would think of something like, say, a shark, right? The dorsal fin on the shark is something that you're aware of, right? It's that like fin that sort of sticks up the back, whereas the posterior part of the shark, would be like the end of like the main, flipper, I guess, in the back. Whereas, for people, these terms are the same. They're interchangeable. So like anterior and ventral referring to the front, posterior and dorsal referring to the back. Again, superior, we're talking about something that is going to be like higher on like the vertical axis of the body, if you want to think of it that way. And then proximal and distal, again, closer to the torso or further away from the torso. So these anatomical terms are something that if you consider them as comparative things, I think that will certainly be helpful. So there's two ways I'm going to ask you to know this. You will see this diagram again as something to label, and then also examples, such as some of the examples that I've given to you in this video already. Any anatomical parts in the video will be very common examples. So I want to ask you about like some obscure bone. We'll talk about things just like I did here. Like the ankle, say, being distal to the knee. So using common parts like that just to help you go through and practice with the terminology. So thank you for taking the time to watch, and just make sure you answer the questions that are linked in this assignment after you're finished with the video.